Hello. I've been asked to record a workshop for the Writing Center on the personal essay. I'm Dr. Andrew Geyer, and I'm sorry that we're not in person working on our workshop for the personal essay, but we'll do the best we can with what we have, and what we have today is a video recording. So before we really start to talk about personal essay, let's situate personal essay kind of in the overall spectrum of what you do when you sit down to write. There are four main reasons that we write. Okay, the writing accomplishes four main things. The first purpose is expressive, and that's sort of where the personal essay lives, right? The main idea of an expressive essay is a self-definition. And when you write a personal essay, whether your subject is the house you grew up in, or your pet snake Bruno, or your favorite brother or sister, you're really talking about yourself, right? I mean, you're using your subject to let the writer, the audience know something about you, what you value. In other words, choosing to write about your pet snake Bruno says something about you as a person, right? First of all, that you have a pet snake Bruno, and second of all, that you want to brag about it, right? Also, the details that you select, in other words, what you choose to share with the audience, says something about you, right? And the way that you structure your paper, in other words, what you talk about first, what you talk about second, what you talk about third. By putting something up front, you emphasize it. You say, hey, this is the most important thing, right? Or maybe you save the most important thing for last, and you tell the reader that, hey, I'm going to save the best for last, whatever that may be, right? But by selecting the order, right, you're making a value judgment, and the reader, if they're smart readers, right, is going to get that. So we're talking a little bit about organization, but let's finish talking about purposes, right? The second purpose is a literary purpose, right, and that's to entertain people, right? And the main idea of an essay or a piece of writing with the literary purposes, it's a theme, right? Sort of so that's sort of what that story or that poem or that creative nonfiction piece is about, right? The third purpose is to persuade, right? To try and get someone to do something or to believe something or a certain thing or a certain way, right? And the main idea is a claim for that sort of a writing purpose, right? And then you've got a referential purpose, and what that does is it informs people or explains something to them, and the main idea there is a thesis, and a lot of times research is involved. So expressive purpose, literary purpose, right? Persuasive purpose, and referential purpose. And again, with personal essay, we're mostly going to do the expressive purpose, right? Organization, there are also four main ways to organize writing, right? Description, which puts things in place order, right? In physical order, and it also engages the senses, right? You've got narration, that puts things in time order, like when you tell a story, this happens, then this, then this, then this, right? Then you've got classification, which organizes things systematically, right? It relates the parts of a system, right? And then you've got evaluation, which makes value judgments, right? You say whether something's good or bad, based on certain measuring sticks, certain criteria, right? So when we think personal essay, we're going to have to describe, aren't we? Right? We're going to have to narrate at least some, and we're going to make value judgments. We already talked about that. In other words, in order of importance, right? I'm saying this is more important than that. That's a value judgment, right? All right. So now let's think about laying this thing out on the page, right? In other words, are you going to have an introduction? Well, not the same kind of introduction as you might have in a persuasive essay or a referential one, right? But you do have to start, right? But you don't want to say, I will tell you about my pet snake, Bruno. I will tell you the reasons why I love Bruno more than any other snake, right? That's a mistake. Don't do that, right? What you want to do is that instead to start out with some kind of a detail, right? That's going to get the audience's attention, and that's going to sort of like put the audience right in that spot where you want them to be, right? So maybe you'd say something more like, I love the way my pet snake Bruno, who's 6 feet long, feels on my shoulders. He weighs 30 pounds, right? Whoa, you got a 30-pound snake on your shoulders. I'm interested, right? But I don't want to talk about my pet snake Bruno because I don't like snakes. So if I'm going to write my personal essay, and the thing that I'm going to kind of use as an example today, rather than Pet Snake Bruno, is the ranch I grew up on, right? I'm from Southwest Texas, and see, woo, right? And I grew up on a cattle ranch. My dad still lives there. When I go home to land. And when I describe the house I grew up on, the ranch I grew up in, I'm going to start with the house I grew up in, right? But the inside of the house isn't what makes it be interesting, right? It's the outside, right? Where I grew up in a desert, and there's not really any trees, right? There's mostly cactus and mesquite, right? Nothing like here in South Carolina. And so the house that I grew up in, right, my dad built it, and it's on a hill. It's on the highest hill in the area. And so when you're standing on the front porch of that house, and it has a wraparound porch, the porch goes all the way around, which is really kind of cool. You can see for miles, literally. I mean, you could walk out on the front porch and look west, which is, the sunset direction. And you can see 3 or 4 miles in the distance. It's bizarre. I mean, living in South Carolina, I mean, you can see the next tree essentially, right? So I grew up with that view, and it's a really cool view, and it's the thing that I love the most about going home, right? So what I'm going to do with my personal essay is I'm going to use description and some narration and some evaluation, and I'm going to order my paragraphs, right? Each time I talk about a different part of the ranch, right? And I'm going to talk about it as I look out from that house off that porch. I'm going to start a new paragraph. So each paragraph is a separate thing, and they all relate to each other because they're all on the ranch, right? Okay, so we'll start out. I'm sitting in a rocking chair on my front porch, right? And I'm looking out, and the thing that I see first is the stables, right? The horse lot. You folks, Aiken's kind of horse country, right? It's one of the reasons I was drawn to this place. So you folks that know horses know that horses are high maintenance animals, right? You can't just let them run and everything will take care of itself. That's not how they work, right? So that's one reason why the stables were right next to the house, right? Because it was handy to get to them, right? And if there was a problem, you'd know about it right off the bat. You'd hear them, right? But the other thing is that horses are probably the farm animal that smells the best. Right. So if you're gonna have animals concentrated close to the house, you probably want it to be the horses, right? We'll talk about the pig pens in a minute. They're kind of far away, right? All right. So you're looking off to the west, and the first thing you see is this big tin stable, right? And it's got a white horse fence around it, right? And there are 6 stalls there. We only had 4 horses usually at a time, but there are 2 extra stalls in case sometimes we keep horses for other people, etc. Right? So there's 6 stalls, and each one of those stalls has a water trough and a feed trough inside of it, right? Every morning, right, I had to get up and go feed those horses day in and day out and make sure that their water troughs the floats were fine, and there was no problems with them. Sometimes horses will play with horse floats, right? They'll play with those floats and they'll mess them up. But anyway, once a week I swept out the tack room. So all of those details, they're going to go in that first body paragraph that's going to talk about the horse lot, right? My intro is gonna lay out that the house is on top of the hill, and the view from the house is the main thing about it, right? And then my next paragraph is the stables, and then next, if you're looking a little further away, do you see I'm putting things in place order, right? A little farther away on the other side of the horse lot of the stables was the hay barn, and if you guys have ever been in a hay barn, there's this smell of a hay barn, right? Especially if the hay, like we had coastal Bermuda hay and cured in the sun, and man, it just smells so good. I mean, you get why animals eat hay. I mean, I'm not going to eat hay, but I get the attraction, right? So that's a really nice smell, and used to have to go down to the hay barn and load up the truck with hay for the cattle, right? And we'd go around and put hay out for the cows, and so that was the thing I did after I fed the horses, right? I had to go a little further out, load up the truck with hay, and then drive around the ranch and feed the cattle, right? So all that's going to go in my hay barn paragraph, right? On the far side of the hay barn, the farthest away from the house, was the pig pens, right? And you guys that have ever been around pigs, you understand why, right? Also, the wind almost never blew from that direction, right? So we didn't have to smell the pigs. The pigs were far away from the house, and they were downwind. So it was rare that we got a whiff of them, which is nice. Pigs taste good. I don't know if you guys eat bacon. I love it, but man, pigs smell bad, right? So that's the West, right? And that's the first 1, 2, 3, 4 of my paragraphs, because I got an introduction and I got 3 paragraphs. and that may be enough for your personal essay, depending on how long it is. I mean, I might could stop there and then go straight to my conclusion, which is gonna share something with you about why that stuff, you know, why is it relevant, right? In other words, I might talk about how that time growing up on the ranch shaped my life, about how working with those horses and cows and even the pigs, right, helped make me the person I am. I mean, I still wear boots for a reason. Or else, if I still need more length on my essay, I might walk around the house and look to the east, right? And so when you look from the east, the closest thing to the house was the weaning lot, right? In other words, we had this area where we'd, one of the ways that we grew our cow herd, right, our cattle herd, was by keeping heifers, which are cows that haven't had calves yet, right? And calving them out. In other words, it was kind of risky because just like with people, a lot of times first babies are a problem. And so, you know, we'd try to get the heifers, the very pregnant heifers, up into that weaning lot, you know, prior to their giving birth. And so we'd be close and we'd know if there were problems and we'd be able to go out and help. And one of the things that I'll describe in that paragraph is that we had a setup there for helping the mamas give birth if they had problems, right? There was a special kind of a head gate that we had where we could open the side of it and get to the cow, but she'd be immobilized so she wouldn't get to us, right? Cows aren't pets, guys. And so, you know, there's other equipment that was involved with that, and I might talk about that in the paragraph where I'm talking about the weaning lot, right? Then on the far side of the weaning lot was the generalized, was the lot for all the cattle. And there was an irrigation motor there. Remember, I grew up in the desert, so there's not water, right? So there was an irrigation pump, an electric one, and a big 35-foot circular cow trough, right? Big. It was the most water around for miles in that area, right? And so the cattle would come up and drink, and we'd put the hay out there, right? When we'd be feeding cattle, there'd be hay racks that we put the hay into, and so the cattle would come up to the water lot and they'd eat and they'd drink, and then they'd go back out, right? The water lot out in the brush. We'll talk about the brush in a second. So one of the cool things about that big water trough was, because it was the largest standing water for miles, the biggest area of it, right? Migrating birds would fly through and they'd stop in our cow lot, right? And like for example, I don't know if you guys know what a whooping crane is, but they're an endangered species, and there's a flock of them in Texas. There's 183 of them, I think, at last count. And those big cranes, when they migrated, they would fly through and they would land in that cow lot, and they would drink out of the water trough, and they'd eat the dung beetles down there, they'd eat bugs and all that kind of stuff, and they'd stay for a day or two sometimes. These giant birds, and if you've ever seen a crane fly, they have this huge wingspan, and so it was really cool, right? In the fall, those cranes would come, and one of the things that we looked for was them settling in. There were sandhill cranes that would fly with them, so there'd be all these giant birds down there, right, doing their thing and wandering in among the cattle. And that's a cool memory that I have, right, that's associated with that place. And so when I was talking about the cow lot, I'd talk about that memory in that spot, right? And then on the far side of that was the brush, right? In other words, I grew up in the north end of the Coahuilan Desert, right? In other words, it's mostly scrub brush and cactus and mesquite. And right around the house I grew up in, it's cleared, right? In other words, there's about 40-acre fields that surround the house, right? So about 40 acres worth in every direction, there's grass, right? That we grew for hay and that we grazed the cattle on, right? And then beyond that grass, there's thick brush that the cattle would wander into. And we'd have to, when we work cattle, like twice a year, fall and spring, we'd have to round those cattle up, and we'd round them up and drive them up into that water lot. And there were some cow pens there that we worked the cattle. So I talked last about that brush. So one of the cool things about the brush was that there's an electric pump in the water lot that filled up that big trough, but all the other water on the ranch is from windmills, right? And so there was a windmill from the hill. You could see it about, I don't know, probably 3/4 of a mile from the house. It poked up over the brush, right? And you could see the blade spin. And at the base of that windmill, there was a trough and a clearing, right? And so those were spread around the ranch so that the cattle could water wherever they were. So one of the things you could see when you looked out from the porch there is those windmill blades going around and around. And the thing is, if you've ever been to West Texas, any of you that have, you know, the wind almost always blows. It's really rarely ever completely still there. And so you know, I remember seeing the windmills out there, and you know, we'd climb the windmills and get up there. My dad said, "Don't you do that?" And we'd go do that. So one of the things I might talk about in that brush paragraph was sneaking off out there and climbing up on top of the windmills and looking out as a kid. Right? That's a memory that I have that's associated with those things. So by this time, I mean, depending on how long your essay is, I'm probably at the end of my essay, and I'm going to move on to my conclusion. And again, what I'm going to do in my conclusion is talk about why the things I've talked about matter to me now, right? I mean, I'm 56 years old, and I haven't lived on that ranch since I was 18. I mean, so almost 40 years later, you know, all those memories are so clear to me. And the reason is that you know, that place, that way of life that I grew up living. Not many people live that way anymore. You know, most people used to live that way, but now almost no one does. And so the thing I didn't understand when I was that age is that how rare that experience was. I mean, I used to have to work real hard. I started working when I was 10, and I didn't like feeding the horses and feeding the cattle and feeding the pigs and working cattle and doing all that stuff. But now I look back on it and I realize what a magical thing that was for me as a person, right? When I write fiction, and I've published 9 books, a lot of what I write about is that. I mean, you know, it creeps in. It impacted me, and that's what I would do with my conclusion. You know, I would make it clear that those things are important to me because of the lasting imprint they've had on my lives. I mean, I was a country kid. I was a ranch kid. I have 4 kids. I love my family so much, but my children are city kids, right? They look at life in a really different way than the way I look at life. Their lens is different from my lens. And so somewhere in my essay, probably up front, and then again at the end, I'd probably put that bit in about the lens I look at life through, right? It's a country lens. It's a ranch boy lens, right? It's a way that my own children don't see the world. And that's a difference between us. So I'd probably close with that, you know, and try and leave the reader with an impression, right? With a lasting thing that they can carry away. Right? So we've talked about, right, using that expressive purpose to make a self-definition. What's my self-definition from that essay? Well, I'm a ranch boy who doesn't live on the ranch anymore, right? But the ranch has impacted me as an adult, right? So there's my self-definition, right? I've used description. I've used narration, right? I've put things in place order. I've told stories, right? And I've made value judgments, right? I mean, I'm obviously letting you know that that place where I grew up is important to me, that I value it. And I've tried to talk to you about why I value it. So all of those kinds of things are things that you're going to do in a personal essay, no matter what you're writing about, whether it's your pet snake, Bruno, or the place where you grew up. We don't really have a way to question and answer, so I'm going to leave this there. But I hope you've gotten something out of this, and hopefully, you know, whatever reason that you're sitting down to write your personal essay, whether it's for a class or to try and publish in a magazine or whatever it is you're going to do with it, I hope this helps. Thanks. Bye.